Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Eden Mabon of LightCycleAstrology.com. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing Mantic Monday episode number 9. We are taking a look at the most prominent aspect that is happening for the week ahead here, which is definitely the full moon in Aries that is building all throughout the beginning of the week and is happening on Friday. So normally we take a look at a bunch of aspects and we try to sort of delineate and give meaning or come up with some archetypal themes to watch for a collection of aspects that is coming through for us. But this week, anything that is happening really is just either in support of the full moon that is happening in the sign of Aries on Friday, or is kind of in the peripheral and is probably going to be overridden by this potent and powerful full moon that we are coming up on. So today we're just going to focus in and hone in on the full moon in Aries. We'll take a look at the aspects that are culminating around the time of the full moon, and we will also dig into the archetypal themes to watch for or some philosophical underpinnings that describe full moons just in general, because this is such a powerful full moon. First of all, we have, of course, full moons are a time where the lights stand in opposition, but this is the time where the lights stand in opposition in these very powerful cardinal signs of Aries and Libra, which is the threshold from the light half of the year into the dark half of the year, respectively. So you really get a very powerful and potent full moon every year when you do have the Aries full moon. But this full moon is also happening alongside of a third and final square between Venus and Uranus. So this is really concluding a couple of things here. We have the conclusion of the Venus retrograde cycle that we had all summer long, and Venus was going through these square aspects to Uranus. Well, this is the third and final sort of bow on that story that is happening, but it's happening at the same time as the full moon. And Venus is also playing a big part in hosting the planets that are involved with the full moon. So Venus is about to move into the sign of her fall or depression in Virgo. And we have this sort of conclusion to a Venus retrograde story. And then if you think about the Mars side of the equation, we have a full moon happening in Mars's sign. Mars, soon after the full moon, is going to be making a very powerful square to Pluto right before entering his sign of Scorpio. And then once Mars is in Scorpio, a bunch of planets run through Scorpio during Scorpio season, and he is playing the host to those planets. So you really do see these very powerful Venusian archetypes that are happening alongside of a buildup of Mars archetypes. So that is a story that is going on with this week, is we're sort of wrapping up one part of the summer that has been really prominent involving Venus, and then we're sort of shifting into a pretty potent Marsy time ahead. So we'll take a look at the transits happening alongside the full moon this coming Friday, and we'll also take a look at some archetypal themes to watch for. Before we do, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, hit notifications so you don't miss any videos. Leave me some comments in the comment section. And if you would like to get a reading from me, you can always check out readings that I offer at lightcycleastrology.com. Okay, well, let's pull up the real-time clock and we'll begin to articulate what is happening with this full moon. So first of all, this full moon is coming through for us Friday, September the 29th. I have a time for 9:56 a.m. and this is GMT time. So just trying to create a central time zone for everybody to calculate from. I don't really think it's so important to know the exact time of the full moon, just to know that it's happening or that energy is building up all week until Friday. And then Friday is really kind of the peak of the energy. But the big story here, besides just a powerful full moon that is happening in these cardinal signs that have to do with turning from either into the light half of the year or into the dark half of the year, this time of balance or major transition, which is always potent. But this particular year, we get this full moon happening alongside of the third and final square that Venus makes to Uranus. So you can see here is Venus at 22 degrees and 26 arc minutes of Leo, now recovered, moving, pretty nicely after her retrograde in this sign. But she has been making these squares to Uranus all summer long. She did so first, of course, direct after she entered Leo. She then turned retrograde and made a square back to Uranus during her retrograde motion. And then she turned forward and has been heading towards the third and final square. Well, this is so interesting that this happens exactly on the time of the full moon. Now, why this is important from the standpoint of looking at planetary dignities from the traditional or ancient Hellenistic method is because, of course, here is Venus being the host of the sun, right? Venus is the host of Libra. And so going through that square with Uranus is going to inform the solar types of things that are going on in her sign of Libra at this time. Now, this is just an aside, but also what is kind of dynamic about this is the sun is also the host of Venus, right? Venus is still in Leo, the sign of the sun. So you have this mutual reception that is taking place, a kind of exchange that Venus and the sun are sort of working out with one another, being in each other's signs. But also Venus is the host to Mars because Mars is in her sign of Libra. And this is really important because the full moon is happening in one of Mars's temples of Aries, right? So Venus really has a big, she holds both the sun and Mars, and through Mars, the moon, she sort of holds them to her archetypal theme. So that's part of the symbolic message that is coming through, is just that this full moon is going to be Marsy, but it's also going to be very Venusian or have to do with Venusian things as well. So pretty amazing. And then if we go forward, watch this. If we go forward in time, I just want to share this with you coming up. We'll talk more about this on the channel, but coming along right around the October the 8th, October the 9th, we have Mars making a perfected square to Pluto just before Mars enters his temple of Scorpio here. So you might read this as like, hey, there's a very Marsy full moon that is happening right before a pretty Marsy time where Mars becomes empowered, right? And then, of course, we have eclipses coming through. And then after this, you see we have the second eclipse comes through. Well, we have a first eclipse happening on October the 14th in a Venus-ruled sign of Libra. And then we get a bunch of planets beginning to enter Scorpio. Pretty soon after this, we get Mercury on the 22nd. We get the sun on the 24th. And then eventually we even get, the moon, the new moon. So there's a pretty Marsy time ahead. Now, going back just a little bit too, one thing that's important is we also get Venus entering Virgo, the sign of her fall. So I think that is a part of the story. I'm not going to get too much into the Venus moving into Virgo right now because that really deserves its own video, but that is a part of the story. If you wanted to try to figure out all of these things that are happening and all of the dynamics, you would sort of include Venus rapidly moving towards a place where she is depressed or fallen as well, because she plays such a big part in the full moon that is happening because she's hosting Mars, where the full moon is, being hosted by from her sign of Aries, if that makes sense. So this is just sort of what's transpiring around the time of the full moon. And you can see it's very, very dynamic. So let's go ahead now and we'll just talk about the themes that may have to do with this full moon. I think that in order to understand this full moon, it's helpful to go back to the fundamental symbolic meaning of what full moons represent within astrology. Now, in the ancient world, there tended to be kind of two big ways that ancient philosophers thought about reality or existence. And these two ways had to do with them viewing that there was kind of a realm that permeated everything and that was connected to source or was source. And then, of course, we also had a material realm that seemed like it was built on duality. And so one thing that is really important is that the moon in general for ancient astrologers tended to represent the impermanence of that material realm, how things are being born and living and then dying, or they are coming into being and then going out of existence again. So there's this fluctuation, and we see that within the changing face of the moon, right? The moon begins as a dark moon and then grows in light night by night, and then eventually becomes full, and we have just a quick moment where the light has culminated, right? But it doesn't last. It begins to wane thereafter. So the moon tended, just in general, broadly speaking, to represent the dualistic nature of the material realm. But this is interesting because we have a full moon that is reflecting the light of the planet that represented the permanence of the source, or connected to source. And that, of course, was the sun. The sun had that symbolic connection to things that were eternal, things that were ever present in terms of knowledge or wisdom or truth. The light, I'm sure you've heard like the saying, the light of wisdom or the light of knowledge. So light has always been connected to both wisdom, but also, of course, the source. However you view that, of course, God and things like this. So the sun is shining the light on the moon, right? And the moon is reflecting that ideal image of source. But the moon is the symbol that says, well, what happens down here within the material realm when we try to take an ideal, when we work with some kind of eternal truth or knowledge, or we have some connection to source that we want to somehow bring down and manifest within the material realm. How does that work out? That is fundamentally kind of the philosophical underpinnings behind the symbolism of the full moon in astrology, is that tension that takes place where we have the sun happening in one sign that is going to be shining the eternal knowledge, truth, or wisdom of that sign, and the moon reflects that. But the moon says, well, what happens when you take that ideal? What happens when you try to make it real? What happens when it happens within the material realm and it meets with opposites? And I'll give you an example of this, because this is how you know that you live in duality. If you think about how hard it would be to describe to somebody that maybe was from a different planet or something like this or whatever, but imagine describing to somebody and defining to them what day is if you had never experienced night. I don't know, maybe you always go to sleep before night happens, or maybe you're from a different solar system and there's two suns and there's never ever nighttime. But just imagine if we lived in a reality that there was only daytime all the time. You'd have never experienced nighttime. If somebody came up to you and said, how do you define daytime? Because we live in this realm of duality, or of opposites being put together, you get the sense that it's really hard to define source or oneness. You really have to do it down here in the material realm by knowing or experiencing the opposite to that. Right. So because we have experienced darkness, because we have experienced nighttime, it's very easy for us to say, well, daytime is defined as, the time where the light is happening, and, there's light. And likewise, you could define nighttime by knowing or experiencing daytime, right? You could say, well, nighttime is when it's dark and there's no light. So that's how you sort of wrap your mind around this philosophical concept of the fact that we live within the material realm that is built of opposites, or built in duality. Now, of course, we don't just live in the material realm. We have that connection to source. And that is fundamentally kind of an image or a concept that is underlying what full moons tend to represent. They tend to represent that we have source giving us knowledge or ideals from one place in the zodiac, but those ideals are being reflected off of the moon, and the moon stands as a symbol that says, yeah, those ideals are really, really great and all, but what happens when ideals, or what happens when source filters down through the world of cause and effect, filters down through a realm of impermanence and time and things living and dying and being subject to karma, right? That is really what we're talking about. And I think that this Aries full moon is really important to sort of dive into that underlying philosophy, because we are seeing the light stand in opposition in these cardinal signs that are also almost like the big daytime and the big nighttime within the year, right? We have 6 months of like the big daytime or the light half of the year between Aries and the end of Virgo. And then we move into a dark half of the year where we have almost like a big nighttime that is happening between the beginning of Libra until the end of Pisces, right? So it's almost like the annual night or the annual day, 6 months of light, 6 months of night is happening. And the full moon is happening in those signs that change over from one to the other, right? Hopefully you can follow that. But so it's a moment where the philosophical understanding of a full moon in the archetype itself is really expressed vividly. It's really prominent. And that leads us into how we may be able to understand what the meaning or message behind an Aries full moon is getting at. Now, of course, we have other things playing into this. At the same time, we had the Venus square Uranus that is going through the last perfected aspect, and it's sort of tying the bow on the story that we had for the Venus retrograde all summer long. Venus soon to be moving into Virgo, into the sign of her fall, and playing the host of both the sun and the moon. But just putting that aside for a moment and just talking about the Aries full moon, if the sun represents source, oneness, eternality, eternal knowledge, or noble ideals, the sun in Libra is going to give us Libran ideals, such ideals as balance, fairness, justice, marriage, seeing another's point of view, harmony. These are all Venus, exalted Saturn, and sun in fall kinds of things, right? Libra is the sign by ancient astrology that had the dignity designations, where we are talking about a Venus ruled sign. We are talking about a sign that exalts Saturn. And of course, this is the sign where the sun was said to be in fall or depression. So if you combine all of those planetary dignities, you get the quality of Libra. And you come up with things like balance, fairness, justice. We all know that Librans tend to, the stereotype, right, is that Librans always get married, or like they're the people that tend to be in marriages or whatever. But you get that because, of course, there you have Venus and you have Saturn being exalted or lifted up. So it's kind of like you're in relationship, and it's lasting a long time, and it's working out, right? So this is a part of how you get the characteristics of Libra just in general, but things like balance, fairness, justice, marriage, seeing another's point of view, that's also very much connected with Libra. And of course, harmony, which is just generally connected with Libra, but also we get that, of course, from Venus. So these are all Libran ideals that the sun is shining forth. And I think the moon's job here is to say, yeah, those are all wonderful ideals, right? But what happens when those ideals meet with reality or get filtered down through a realm of cause and effect, of impermanence, of things coming into being and passing away again, and of course a realm built of opposites or built in duality? How do you even know what any of those things are if you have never experienced or known its opposite? How do you know what balance is if you've never been imbalanced? If you were always just balanced, if everything was always just perfect and in this perfect state of balance, and somebody said to you, well, what is balance? You might be at a loss to even describe what that is. But because we are used to being imbalanced, we know when we're balanced, right? Because we've been treated unfairly, we know when we're being treated fairly. Because there is so much injustice in the world, we know what justice should be like. And so these are ideals. But the full moon in Aries represents the tension between trying to bring down those ideals into a physical reality or some kind of form within the material world. And that's the big tension that happens. So the Aries full moon says these are all lofty ideals, but what happens in reality? In reality, you might have in the world imbalance. You might have things like victory over others, right? Aries is the place where the sun is exalted and overcomes the darkness. This is very much the one that becomes the hero, right? The hero is victorious. Well, that's not fairness. That's not everybody getting a piece. It's me being, victorious as a singular hero within my own right. So victory over others helps you define what fairness is. If you only had people trying to be heroes, you would never ever have any fairness. But likewise, if you only had fairness, you would never ever have any heroes. So this is where the dualistic nature of the full moon really brings in that tension of some of these things. Other things like might makes right might stand in opposition to justice, or being single might stand in opposition to being married. Seeing only your own point of view, of course, stands in opposition to being able to see someone else's other point of view. And of course, we have the Venus keyword, or a typical thing that people think of Libras is harmony, right? They're the peacemakers. They're the ones that negotiate or harmonize things. Well, in Aries, you have the opposite of conflict. How do you define harmony if there is always harmonious situations around you? Well, you define it because you know what it's like when you have conflicts. So those are all Mars, exalted sun, Saturn in fall kinds of things. So that's the tension. So the full moon always gives us the ideals that stand in tension with reality or with the material realm. When source is reflected inside the material realm, it can only be known by opposites. So we work with that tension and we gain the knowledge of what things are by playing in the land of opposites. That's sort of the journey of being alive in one sense, right? So that is what you might expect as themes. You might expect that we're playing with these themes of like, okay, well, what is fair? Well, maybe we have to experience some unfairness. Or what does justice look like? Well, maybe we have to deal with injustice, and maybe we're trying to find the balance between those two things. If we are in a relationship, maybe we need some alone time, or maybe we get in a fight, and that sort of serves to help remind us, okay, well, this is the ideal that I'm going after, but it's hard to obtain, right? But nevertheless, that is still the ideal that you want to head towards, right? You don't want to stay in conflict, but you're sort of rebalancing some of these Libra and Aries kind of things, right? So again, that could be themes of balance, fairness, justice, marriage, seeing another's point of view, and harmony that is in attention and being defined as by maybe things like imbalance or victory over others, or might makes right. Being single, seeing only your own point of view, needing that time to just do you and see things from that point of view. And of course, conflict or fights or tensions or stuff like that. So very social, very relational, has to do with relationships, has to do with maybe independence, of course, has to do with finding that balance between being an independent proprietor and somebody that is also maybe dealing with the responsibilities of relationship or duties to other people that we have relationships or share family or love ties with, or something like that. So you definitely get that big theme just in general with this full moon in Aries that really stands out. You tend to get those themes kind of every full moon, but again, I think that the full moon in Aries really is almost like the quintessential full moon, almost, you might say. So we work with that tension and experiencing the opposite of what the ideal is, basically is the thing that helps us understand, define, become aware of, or remember, reflect upon. All of those things is what we're playing with. Now, another thing that I think is really, really a big part of how you might view this full moon in Aries is also coming from the fact that this is sort of the culminative story that began 6 months ago when the sun was last traveling through the sign of Aries, right? The sun's light is being reflected from within the place where the sun is exalted on the moon. So this is also a really almost esoteric, deep meditation that you might almost get into if you think about the dignities here and where planets are. You have the sun shining from the place where the sun is fallen or depressed. Now, that fallen or depressed solar light is being reflected off of the moon. The moon is traveling through the sign where the sun is exalted. So that's kind of a trippy thing if you think about it. It's as if we're meant to reflect on and evaluate. A very Libran keyword is evaluate. People don't like the word judgment, but of course, this is the sign of the scales. This is a sign where, because the sun has fallen and goes into the underworld, becomes less powerful at this time of the year and metaphorically sort of dies. It's as if we're meant to reflect on and evaluate solar things or solar themes that have been transpiring over the last 6 months since the sun was last in Aries. And of course, the sun was exalted. So we saw the beginning or inceptions of things that have to do with solar things for ourselves. So how has our aim in life been working out? The direction we're heading in, or overarching goals, ambitions, desires, our purpose or life mission are maybe the things that are solar related that have to do with kind of a reflection at this time, or maybe a kind of evaluation. So simply, how have things been transpiring that you have been trying to do or work on? Or is there some kind of ideal purpose that you've been striving towards? Is there something that you've been aiming towards as kind of an overarching goal or ambition or life story or direction for yourself? This could be a time where you sort of have to evaluate. I know people don't like the word judge, but you sort of have to put things on the scales and sort of measure and weigh things out. Of course, there could be two possibilities for what you find if you reflect on this. Of course, one could be that things have been going along well and they've been working out. If you're steering or aiming your life towards a certain place and it's been working out well, then it's like, this is great. This is good news. Like, things are measuring up and I'm getting where I'm wanting to go. And of course, that's a positive, right? But oftentimes things don't work out, or there may be a way in which, even if they're working out to some degree, it's not quite meeting our expectation or ideal. And so this is a time where I think that this full moon helps us reflect on what has been happening over the last 6 months. But it specifically has to do with solar things that are important to our lives, right? Now, if things have been working out well, this might simply be a time where you sort of plow those ideals for a time into the underworld. And we see this by the sun moving into the sign of Libra right now, and the sun going through a metaphorical death, that the sun enters the underworld. And that's part of the scale kind of symbolism that we get with Libra, is that the Egyptians said that when you died, you would be judged, and they would put the feather on one side of the scale and they would put your soul on the other. And if you lived a idealistic life, you might say, or a moralistic life, you could say, and your soul was lighter, found to be lighter, or I guess balanced with the feather, that meant you weren't burdened with sin, essentially. So the sun going into the underworld is a big theme here, and the sun connects to our purpose, life direction, our goals, ideals. And if things have been working out well, then this might be simply a time to plow them into the soil so that they can reconnect with the rejuvenating power of the underworld, which means that it might be time to just take a break, rest, connect with family and loved ones. We're moving into the holiday season. Or maybe there's a time where there just needs to be that connection to something deeper, darker, more mysterious that will rejuvenate the effort, right? So that could be one way in which you see themes coming around this full moon. But also, if things have not been shaking out quite well, or it's not meeting the expectations that you want for yourself, it could be a time where, of course, you might simply have to walk away from, or like reorient the boat, right? Make a course correction, or just bury altogether and leave behind if things are proving to not, if you evaluate and weigh things up and it's like, this is not working, this relationship is not working, or this pursuit is not working, or this way that I'm aiming, I'm not getting there, I'm not liking this. This could be a time where the Aries full moon being in a Mars ruled sign, and Mars says you need to cut it out. It's time to bury it, and it's time to separate. It's time to walk away. There could be that as well. Now, of course, many luminaries that have a lot of wisdom have always spoken about not feeling bad when we meet failure, because failure, again, going back to the duality argument or the duality philosophy, is the only way that we really understand, how to succeed. So I don't think that if this is a time where we have to walk away, or there's some way in which we view ourselves as failing after an evaluation, it's like, it's not to feel bad. Failures are really, really, really important to help us get to where we really want to be. So that's important. It's not to feel bad about it, but just to take stock of it and use that as information that is useful for you. So that is the major way that I am seeing the full moon in Aries. Of course, this is some deep things that we get into when we talk about the full moon in Aries. And we have eclipses coming up. We have Venus entering the sign of her fall, and we have a big Mars Scorpio period that is also coming up. So we'll get into that on the channel as time goes on here. I hope you guys got something good in this. Please leave me some comments about what you are thinking about this full moon, if this is landing for you in any way. I'd love to hear any stories that you guys want to share. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll be back soon. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.